I felt like it was a very interesting story. It was very interesting. It was so interesting, very interesting. It was really interesting. It was so interesting. It's really, really interesting. It was so interesting. Hello, hello. It is time for my summer reading wrap up, meaning all of the books that I read in June and July. I forgot to look at my analytics before filming, so I'm going to put them on the screen. I think though over June and July, I read 20 books total. So let's start with the books that I read in June. The first book that I read in June was Hidden Pictures by Jason Rekulak. I read it on my Kindle. This is a horror book about a girl who's like a recovering addict, or she used to be an addict. She gets a job as a nanny for a little boy. He starts drawing these pictures and they just get more and more disturbing. And so she sets off to try and uncover why he's drawing these pictures, where these ideas are coming from. And it was very eerie, very creepy, but I was really enthralled. If it had been a movie, couldn't have watched it. I don't do scary movies, but because it was a book, I was okay. I will say it was a lot scarier because the drawings that the little boy was doing were included in the book. So like she would describe one of the drawings that she found and then there'd be a picture of it. So that was creepy. Overall, I ended up giving this book 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. I did kind of see one of the major plot twists coming, but there were so many others that totally got me. So I would recommend this book. The next book that I read was Rebel Witch by Kristen Ciccarelli. This is the second book. It's the Crimson Moth duology, but the first one is called Heartless Hunter. I read Heartless Hunter last year, maybe around this time. I honestly can't remember. I was excited to see that this book was finally released on Kindle Unlimited. I loved it. I read through it so fast. It is still dual point of view. I'm pretty sure you get to see, oh, I can't remember their names. The 2 main characters, you go back and forth between their points of view. And it was very interesting. It was a little bit, I don't want to say repetitive, but I could see how some people would get bored by it because it was kind of the same plot devices being used over and over again. But I felt like it all made sense for the story, so it didn't bother me that much. I ended up giving this one 4 stars. I really, really enjoyed it. If you haven't given this duology a chance yet, you should definitely read it. I then read 0 Days by Ruth Ware. This book is about this husband-wife duo that kind of perform heists in a way, but then she shows up at her house after a job to find her husband has been murdered, and everyone kind of assumes that she's the one that did it because her alibi doesn't really make sense. There's holes in her story, stuff like that. So she is on the run trying to figure out who is responsible for killing her husband, and it was a wild ride. I will say the descriptions of grief that she was feeling were so intense that I almost had to put the book down. But I'm glad that I pushed through because overall I felt like it was a very interesting story. It kept me on the edge of my seat. Really the only thing that I didn't love about this book was I predicted something at the very beginning, but as the book went on, I was like, oh no, okay, I was wrong. There's no way that could have happened. Like, no, I'm wrong. And then at the very end of the book, it happened. And I was like, I don't hate that it happened, but given everything that happened over the span of the book, it just didn't really make sense for that to happen anymore. That's just me being a little bit nitpicky. I can suspend disbelief because it is a work of fiction, but I gave it 4 stars. I then read the 9th book in the Horus Heresy, The Mechanicum by Graham McNeill. This one had everything that it needed for me to love it, but it just didn't hit. And I think that the problem is I was audiobooking it and I started listening to it the last week of school and then kind of fell off listening to it and picked it up a couple weeks later. And I just think that I wasn't really in the mood to be reading it and the timing was off, and I just wasn't really giving it my full attention. So because of that, I felt very confused the whole time. I was lost. I wasn't really connected to any of the characters. Even though I can take a step back and objectively say, like, this was probably a very good book and I would normally have really liked it, it just didn't hit this time. So for that reason, I gave it 3 stars, but I would recommend it. You do learn a lot of important things that you need for the series to move forward in this book. Then I continued the War of Lost Hearts trilogy with book 2, Children of Fallen Gods by Carissa Broadbent. Oh my goodness, I love this trilogy. I loved this book. It was just a really beautiful and well-developed continuation to the story. That it was a long book, okay? It was a long book, but it felt like everything that happened needed to happen. None of the characters did anything like crazy out of character for them, and I just thought it was really well done. So I gave it 4 stars. I love this trilogy. Then I finished that trilogy with Mother of Death and Dawn. This book I ended up giving 4.5, and honestly, this is gonna sound weird, but I didn't rate any of the individual books in the trilogy higher than like 4.5, but I would consider this trilogy like a 5-star trilogy for me, like a fantasy 5-star trilogy. I just thought it was so well done. I loved the characters. I loved the relationships that they formed with each other and the relationship that you form with them. And I just felt like everything wrapped up in such a beautiful, realistic way. I would highly recommend this series to anyone. Again, this last book was pretty long, and I will say that it started to feel a little bit repetitive in the middle of this book because it just followed the same pattern of they get separated. One of them has to go rescue the other, now they're together, then they get separated. One has to go rescue the other, now they're together, they get separated. You get the idea. But even with that tiny critique, I still thoroughly enjoyed this book, love the trilogy, and I wish I owned the physical copies of the original covers because I just think they're so stunning and gorgeous. Oh well, it is what it is. Then I read Till Summer Do Us Part by Megan Quinn. I was so unprepared for this book. I was not expecting what it ended up being. Okay, I'll just say it that way. From the synopsis, like from the little blurb that I read, it sounded like it was going to be fake dating. The main character lies about being married to try and like fit in at work because everyone at work is happily married, and she actually just went through a really messy divorce. So she lied about having a husband, and then they were like, oh, well, why haven't you ever talked about him? Like, why don't you bring him up? And she says, oh, well, we're going through problems. We're going through a tough time in our marriage. Thanks for asking. Turns out that her boss, her husband, like the boss's husband, is like the best marriage counselor in this state. And she's like, oh my gosh, it would make me so happy if I could set y'all up with my husband. One of her best friend's brother ends up filling in as her husband, and they end up going on this like week-long marriage retreat that ends up being like a sex camp. So had I known that, probably would have steered away from this book just because it was so explicit and so crazy. But one thing that I really did appreciate was, you know, obviously they spent a lot of time in therapy and like learning therapeutical things to help with marriage. I just found the backstories of both characters to be so delicately handled and very complex in a way that you wouldn't necessarily expect for such a silly and spicy book. But I really did appreciate them kind of exploring their own emotions, their own feelings, discovering who they are. Just like the way that their relationship finally does develop is really, really interesting, and it's really beautiful. I'm not a spice reader, so that was a lot. But I ended up giving it 3 stars because I was entertained. Just the Nicest Couple by Mary Kubica. First of all, this book does not match the description at all. It's following 2 different couples, so you see the husband from one couple and the wife from the other couple. Those are your 2 main points of view. And essentially, the wife, who you see her point of view, her husband goes missing. And so you kind of see back and forth how they're navigating that. I kid you not. I was reading it on my Kindle and I was like, okay, surely, I feel like I've been reading a while. Surely the book is about to pick up. You know, I'm probably at like 30%. This was a very long build up, but surely something's about to happen. I was at 70%. Nothing happens in this book. Nothing happens. And then literally all of the plot twists I called from a mile away. Not once was I like on the edge of my seat, feeling thrilled, needing to know what happens. I was just bored. It was not a good book, not a good thriller, not even a good like mystery or even just fiction. Like it was just so outlandish and I did not enjoy it. I gave it 2 stars, would not recommend. Then I continued on with the Bridge Kingdom series with the second book, The Traitor Queen by Danielle L. Jensen. I am in love with this series. The Bridge Kingdom, I think I gave it 4 or 4.5 stars, and I gave this one 4.5 stars as well. You are following Lara and Aaron, who I can't really say too much because it would be major spoilers for the Bridge Kingdom. All I can say is if you haven't read it yet, go read it. This book was absolutely crazy. So much stuff happens. It's so fast paced. Love these characters, and I loved the realness and the rawness that you got to see within both characters. And oh my gosh, I just loved it so much. And I loved the way that their story wraps up, because after this book, we do move on to kind of a different couple in the same world. So this kind of is the end of, not the end, but this is the end of like seeing Lara and Aaron's points of view as far as I can tell. And I just thoroughly love these characters so much. Highly recommend this series. Famous Last Words by Jillian McAllister. Wow, I read this book in my 24-hour readathon. The next several books, actually, I read in my 24-hour readathon. Oh my goodness, I was not expecting this book at all. So basically, Cam and her husband is in a hostage situation. Turns out he's the one holding the hostages. So she's like, that's so unlike him. What is going on? Niall is the hostage negotiator, and he is like the best at his job. He knows what he's doing. Well, the hostage situation goes kind of awry, and then it jumps 7 years in the future, which I was scared about because I was like, what do you mean? We're not gonna know. But 7 years later, Cam is still grappling with not having any answers for why her husband did what he did. So she's kind of at a crossroads for, should she move on with her life and just leave him in the past? Or should she keep trying to uncover the truth about what happened? Niall, 7 years in the future, is also still haunted by this case, and he still, like, he just can't let it go. He still thinks that there's more to the story than what they saw. Oh my gosh. I didn't really call any of it. I didn't predict any of it. It was so interesting. It kept me enraptured. Like, I finished it obviously in one day because it was my 24-hour readathon, but I loved it so much. I would definitely recommend this one, and I gave it 4 stars. Next in my 24-hour readathon, I read The Ghostwriter by Julie Clark. Y'all, this book was 5 stars. I could not put this book down. You're following Olivia, who is a ghostwriter, and she has done some things, said some things to where she's like really not getting any jobs anymore. And her father, her estranged father, who she hasn't spoken to in like decades, reaches out and is like, hey, I need your help ghostwriting this last book for me. And it's actually, I'm going to finally tell my side of the story of what happened 50 years ago on the night that both of my siblings were murdered. So people have long suspected that her dad was the one that killed his siblings. Finally kind of get to see through a past present point of view what Olivia is doing to uncover what happened, what her dad is telling her, all the things that she's discovering. And also you're seeing the dad from when he was a kid, and also his sister, which is one of the ones that was murdered. you're getting their points of view in the weeks and months leading up to the murders. When I tell you my jaw dropped, like every single chapter, I was changing my theories, changing my mind on what was happening. I could not figure out anything. It was so interesting, and I have seen so many people try to do this type of story and just fail miserably, but Julie Clark, she figured it out. She did it so well, and I just am obsessed with this book. Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. This book I have known about for a while, and it's always intrigued me because I really do enjoy science fiction. And I finally decided to pick it up, and I'm so glad that I did, because this book was so unsettling, so disturbing, and so like mind-boggling that, yeah, I couldn't put it down. It was so good. I ended up giving this book 5 stars because I was just so impressed with this book. And I know that there are a lot of critiques out there about this book, but I will just say, if you enjoyed the TV show Fringe, I think you should give this book a chance. I do recommend this book. It is science fiction. A lot of things kind of like in the sciencey side of it kind of went over my head, but not to the point where I was like, I don't understand what's going on. It was just like, okay, I don't need to know the specific science for how these things are happening. I just know what's happening, and it's crazy. So I'm not going to say anything. I went into this book completely blind, and that is how I recommend you go into it. It was incredible. Then I listened to the audiobook of Tales of Heresy, which is a combination of 7 different short stories about this time period that we're in the Horus Heresy. Overall, I gave this book, this collection, I guess, 4 stars. Individually, I gave each of the short stories their own rating, and I'm just going to rapid fire blow through them really quick. If you are interested in more thoughts on each individual short story, you can check my Goodreads or my Fable. They're always linked down below, and I kind of put a little bit of a synopsis and my thoughts on each of these short stories on there. Blood Games, I gave 2 stars. The Wolf at the Door, 3 stars. Scions of the Storm, 4.5 stars. The Voice, 5 stars. Call of the Lion, 4 stars. The Last Church, 4 stars. After Deshea, 4 stars. So overall, it was really interesting getting to see all those different stories. I'm not usually crazy about short stories, but I liked all of these. Then I read Never Lie by Frida McFadden. This is actually my book club's pick of the month. So this book follows this couple who is looking at this house that they want to buy, but it's in the middle of a blizzard and they kind of get locked in. This house that they're looking at was previously owned by this therapist or psychiatrist who went missing, I think 3 years prior. So the wife, can't remember her name, she is like really unsettled about being here because she's like, I don't know if this woman is dead or if she's just missing, like they never found her. She's just assumed dead, and she's like, I don't want to be here. This is crazy. I'm so uneasy being here. But then she stumbles across a collection of all these recordings of the therapy sessions that the doctor had with all of her patients. So she starts listening to them and trying to see what happened to her in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. I will say, I just don't think that Frida McFadden is for me. It was super short. I mean, I was intrigued, I was entertained, but when it got to the end, there were so many questions that were just left unanswered. So many like red herrings, I guess you could say. And while I did see one thing coming, the actual plot twist did get me, but it's because Frida McFadden used a specific plot device, I don't know if that's what you call it, that I have a really big issue with, and I'm not going to say it because obviously it would spoil the entire book, but if you know, you know. And it just really made me mad because I was like, it felt like a huge gotcha, and I don't like that. So I did give it 3 stars because I can see how people who enjoy Frida McFadden's work would like this book, but again, I just don't think she's for me. Then I read The One by John Mars. This book left me feeling dirty. And I think that was the point, because once you're following 5 different points of view, and all of them have used this new website called Match Your DNA, which essentially you send in your DNA and they match you with your genetic soulmate. So you're following all 5 of these different people, finding their soulmate, and it was just weird. I believe that the moral of the story was to showcase how garbage humanity is and how we will do anything that we need to justify our own selfishness and our own greed. So in a way, it did accomplish that goal. It got weird and like so weird in some places. Overall, I would recommend it if you are intrigued by that idea. I did think that it was done very well. The book did exactly what it set out to do, which was cause me to like question everything for several days after finishing this book. I don't know if I said it, but I gave that one 3.5 stars. The Inadequate Heir by Danielle L. Jensen. I love these covers, but it's like, I don't know if y'all can even see them because of it's like very reflective. Anyway, this is the 3rd book in the Bridge Kingdom series. This book was about 200 pages too long because like I said, the first 2 books in this series follow Lara and Aaron. This book switches you to the perspectives of Zara and Karis. The problem with this book is literally just the Traitor Queen from Zara and Karis's point of view. To the point where like there were so many scenes copy pasted from Traitor Queen into this book, to the point where I was like, we're not learning anything new from rereading this dialogue, rereading these scenes. Why am I wasting my time on it? Like, it was just so frustrating because I really did like Karis and Zara's stories and how they interacted and the roles that they played that you don't get to see in the Traitor Queen. I just felt like if we would have cut out all of the unnecessary redundancy, you could have cut this book in half. I also think that the amount of spice in this book definitely ratcheted way up from the first 2 books, which was very frustrating for me because, as I've said, I'm not a spice reader, and it was just pages and pages and pages of very explicit graphic scenes that I ended up just skimming because you don't learn anything during those scenes, and I felt like it just kind of almost cheapened their story by reading those scenes, if that makes any sense. I wish it was not as redundant and not as spicy, but I did still give it 3 stars. I then read the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society by Mary Ann Schaefer. This book is entirely letters. So it's London in the 1940s, I think. I think it takes place like right after World War II. And you're just reading all these correspondences written back and forth between people on the Isle of Guernsey and this author who lives in London, and her correspondences with like her like agent and publishing people. Anyway, it was definitely very difficult for me to get into because I was like just waiting for the story to start. Like, I didn't realize it was all letters. But once I accepted that it was just letters and really started getting to know all the characters, I really did fall in love with them. The way that the book is written is just so witty and silly and realistic. Like, it really did feel like I was reading people's letters. Like, it was so interesting, and the overall story is so sweet and endearing, and I would recommend it. I gave this book 4 stars. I picked up the 11th book in the Horus Heresy series, which is Fallen Angels by Mike Lee. This book specifically is a sequel to Descent of Angels that's also in this series. And if you don't know Warhammer, I know this probably sounds so confusing, but it all makes sense if you read it all. I was severely conflicted about this book for a very long time. Descent of Angels, I ended up giving 4.5 stars. I loved it, loved the characters, loved the story. It was just brilliant. And the beginning of this book, I was feeling the same way. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm right back in with these characters. I'm loving this story. And then I started getting a little bit lost, and it wasn't a bad book by any means. You're following Zahariel and Nemiel, which if you read Descent of Angels, those were like the main characters. I don't know, it's just obviously I can't talk too much about it, but there were just a few things that I was really confused by and had issues with. The timeline was a little bit messed up, and there were also just a lot of errors in this book that really threw me off. But overall, I think I'm just gonna give it 3 stars because I'm just still so conflicted about how I feel. I could see giving it 4, but I don't know. It's still unrated on my Goodreads because I just can't make up my mind. And the last book that I read this summer was The Endless War by Daniel L. Jensen. This is the 4th book in the Bridge Kingdom series, and we are still following Zara and Karis. I have to say this book was so much better than The Inadequate Heir because it was all new content. It wasn't just rehashing the same stuff that we already know about. So I really liked this book. I loved the stories. It took a very different path than any of the other books have taken, which I really appreciated. It was very interesting. I loved watching the characters kind of grow and mature, even with, like, you're still seeing Lara and Aaron and all the other like side characters from the first 2 books, which I really loved getting those little sneak peeks into those characters. But this book just felt very well-rounded to me. Again, too much spice that was unnecessary. I feel like a lot of times when authors put a lot of emphasis on spice, it's to make up for the fact that there's a lack of emotional connection and emotional depth between the characters. That wasn't the case in this book. They had such a strong emotional connection with each other that I didn't need the spice to believe that they were in love with each other. Like, I was totally satisfied with their just love outside of the bedroom. I really did not need to be present for all of those descriptions, but putting that aside, I gave this book 4 stars. Honestly, this book feels like the end of the series, to the point where I was like, I own the 5th book. What is it even gonna be about? This wrapped up everything so beautifully. I'm satisfied. But I think the 5th book will follow Aaron's sister, Anna. So it's kind of, I assume that there's going to be a 6th book because the pattern is 2 books on one couple, 2 books on another couple. So I assume we're going to have 2 books on Anna and whatever her story is. Those were all 20 of the books that I read in June and July. They were incredible reading months. I love summer break because I don't work. I'm a teacher. And so I was just able to spend as much time as I wanted reading. I am way ahead on my reading goal for this year, but I'm glad because the school year is about to start back up this week, so might not have as much time for reading, but we'll see. If you enjoyed this video, please go ahead and like it. Comment down any of your thoughts, questions about these books, suggestions about other books that you have for me. Love all of that stuff. And make sure that you are subscribed so that I can see you in the next one. Mwah!